Hello and welcome back to Reading Past Midnight. I'm your host, Ron Rutstein. Today I'm going to be talking about The Rifles by William T. Vollmann. And after that, I'm going to mention two other books, and I'll explain how they kind of relate to the rifles, although they're not meant to relate to the rifles, but we've got certain similarities, and these are both excellent books. Also, A Dream in Polar Fog, which is a novel, and Icebound, Shipwrecked at the Edge of the World, which is a history. And The Rifles is a novel which borders on history. There's a lot of history in it. And it is Volume 6 of The Seven Dreams, a book of North American landscapes, which William T. Vollmann is writing. And as the author of these, he calls himself William the Blind. He has published to date 5 of The Seven Dreams. This is the first one that I read. I'm going to, at some point, read them all. I liked this one quite a bit because I started with this one because I have a lot of interest in the Arctic and a bit in Arctic exploration, which started about 12 or so years ago with a trip my wife and I took to Iceland, and I became enamored of the North and have done a lot of reading about it since then. And The Rifles seemed to me a good place to start. I didn't happen to have a copy of The Ice Shirt, which is on order right now, and I'll be getting that soon. So I'll probably delve into that maybe as the next one, which is meant to be the first in the series. They are not coming out necessarily in the order in which they're meant, I can't say meant to be read, but in the order in which they occur in time. So The Rifles is about the 4th expedition of John Franklin into the Arctic. It is the one where he becomes trapped in ice for multiple years and the entire expedition dies. This is not giving away something in the plot of the story. It's known from the very beginning. And the two main characters are John Franklin and Captain Sub-Zero. Now, John Franklin is living in the 19th century, and Captain Sub-Zero is a relative contemporary. This was published in, 1994. So you could say that he lives in the 90s. There's a joining of these two characters. They are separate, yet not separate. They can kind of sense each other's lives, and you can read this in a number of ways, that maybe their spirits can contact each other. Maybe one is reincarnated into the other. They are both white men, and they are both living at this time in land of the Eskimos, where they don't belong, where they're not prepared to live. Both of them come there seemingly with a sense of exploitation. They're looking for something, for fame, for wealth, for recognition. Sub-Zero, not so much as William Franklin, but Sub-Zero is partially there to re-explore Franklin's death, and maybe he's there to re-explore Franklin's relations with the Eskimo and Native Americans, North Americans, very far north. The two of them are trapped within their personalities and in positions in which they lack the ability to grow. They lack the ability to really understand, although you get the sense towards the end that maybe Sub-Zero is beginning to start to understand some things about the climate and perhaps the people who once could survive in that climate. The novel's called The Rifles because it reflects on the way the introduction of the rifle not only affected the Native American population once they got their hands on them and began to use them, the way it changed the nature of their hunter-gatherer culture, but also the ways in which the explorers used that to manipulate the Native American populations. So, for example, they would provide them with guns and shots and gunpowder, but once they've used up that, they needed them again to facilitate their hunting. And this is brought up in a lot of different ways within the novel. But there's also the fact that despite that, the natives understand the land. They understand how to live there and how to exist and how to hunt, whereas the Europeans, the British, don't. And this leads them to starvation, maybe in an area where they didn't necessarily have to starve. Maybe they could have survived with better planning. Well, they always could have survived with better planning. Without some of the naive assumptions that they made. For example, some of them believed that the farther north they got, the more they would find, the more chances they would have to find open water, which of course isn't true. We understand now that the farther north you go, the colder it gets and the more ice that you have. In the opening of the novel, right at the very beginning, two men, 1948 and 1848. A man was hunting a seal. He stood waiting on the hard, cold sea. Half a mile out from the shore, a plate of ice had buckled and riven in two. In this lead, a thin crust of new ice had formed, as delicate as a girl's skin. And here the man stood, watching a round hole that was smaller than his thumbnail. This is where the seal came to breathe. The man stood very still. He knew that the seal would hear even if he wiggled his toes in his boots. He waited for a long time, gazing at the hole and listening. He was holding a rifle. At last he heard the sound of rippling water. The seal was swimming toward him. He waited. A little jet of water spurted from the hole, and still he waited. The water was being displaced by the seal's body. Then he heard the seal's breath, but it was only the first breath. The man knew that sometimes seals listened from below the ice for danger, exhaling instead of inhaling. The first breath was not necessarily a true breath. But then the seal breathed again. The man pulled the trigger. There was the sound of the shot and a thrashing noise. The seal grunted in agony, and that was the last breath. For the first time, the man leaned forward and saw the seal that he had killed. The water beneath the blowhole was red. The man chopped the hole wider and pulled the dead seal out. There was a small hole in the seal's head where a .22 Magnum had gone in, and a larger one where it had gone out. He had shot very well. The man was happy. Kneeling in the bloody snow, he began peeling away the skin. He cut out the steaming meat. He shouted joyously, and a little boy came running. The boy laughed and put his foot on the dead seal and kicked it. The man cut off a piece of the seal liver and gave it to his son, smiling. Not far away, another man was waiting. Here the sky was gray, with a bar of yellow glare low on the horizon. The fjord, too, was gray. Ice had just begun to form on it in earnest, steely gray ice, with the beginnings of pressure ridges already rising between its flat plates. In places, it was thick enough to support a man's weight. In other places, it could not bear the touch of a pebble, for as yet it was only half frozen. In the middle of a broad channel in which the blackish gray water streamed steadily. Between the ice plates, there were still many leads. The ripples there were like sandbars. The sound of the wind was low, so that the water noises were very audible, speckling the man's ears like the black leopard dots on the beach pebbles. Every now and then, the ice crunched furtively as if a naughty child were eating it. Dead grass twitched in the frozen mud cliffs, and stalks spreading in the wind like the points of the many golden stars. The man's feet ached with cold. His shoes were frozen. He sat shivering and watched the golden grass. He looked down at the thin snowdrifts by his feet, the rocks like broken tables. He studied the streaming water in the fjord. He was starving. These two men were not so different. They both had rifles, but the second man, the white man, sat there by the creaking ice waiting. He did not know how to live in that country. He had no strength to live. His starvation was very strange because he had bullets for his rifle, and there was chocolate in the longboat where the other dead men lay, and not far away was a tin of preserved meat unopened. Sedna sent seals in plenty from under the sea, and they came up to the ice. They were ready to be killed, but the man's rifle did not help him. Expeditions that were unprepared and men who were unaccustomed to living in a particular environment, an environment that was not rich in the resources they were used to being able to take advantage of, led to the deaths of the explorers as their ship was trapped in ice for many years. Sedna, as you find out in the book, is not quite a goddess or a demigod, but a soul that kind of lives towards the bottom of the ocean and can either send up wildlife to be killed to sustain men or can hold back. And here, Vollmann is telling us clearly that she was not holding back. There were resources for these men to live on. They were just completely oblivious. Those men were from John Williams' expedition, and some of them died as they were off trying to explore and find resources. They had canned goods. This is in the early years of canning, and they used lead, which led to mental illness, lead poisoning, insanity. As this insanity grows in Franklin, he becomes more and more in touch with the soul or life force of Sub-Zero, of Captain Sub-Zero, who's not a captain, he's just a name he's taken on for himself, and it's how we know him as a character. Captain Sub-Zero is white and has come to the Great White North as a kind of explorer or just to experience it. He has an affair with Ripa, who is an Eskimo girl. She becomes pregnant. He abandons her. Not a nice guy. And he goes on to put himself in a position where he is going to face for a very brief time the idea of starvation or the inability to take care of oneself because the resources are not there, or he has an inability to properly use the resources because even with modern technology, he doesn't have the knowledge and the experience to use the resources that have been provided for him. So the Native Americans would see the seals as a resource that was provided for them, and Sub-Zero is in a building in the north that's pretty much abandoned for winter. They have people that come through occasionally, and he has heaters. He's got some resources there for him, and he doesn't know how to properly use them. So he is rescued at the very end, where he is near starvation and near freezing to death because he is not properly researched or taken proper precautions or made sure that he is aware of how to use the resources that he has with him. It is this overconfidence that leads to failures of expeditions, of exploring expeditions, and in this particular case, of Sub-Zero, nearly leading to his own demise. The areas of ice are areas, the North Pole, Greenland, Antarctica. These are areas where even today you have to be very prepared for what you're going to run into. And yes, we send tourists to these places on giant ships that are definitely safer than the exploratory ships that were available in the early to mid 19th century as these expeditions were taking place. But still, those expeditions that were best prepared are the ones that survived. And the first part of the book explores the beginning of the relationship of Sub-Zero with Repa. And it's got an almost abusive quality where you understand that he's in love with Repa and Repa is in love with him. But there's the beginnings of something else there, where Repa talks about his love for Jane. Jane is Franklin's wife. Franklin left her in England, and she tells Sub-Zero that she's jealous of Jane. So there's a sense that Repa is kind of off, maybe mentally or emotionally, but later in the book we get a sense that maybe Repa is fully aware of things that Sub-Zero and Franklin are only partially aware of, as their souls or spirits conjoin. This is a very modern novel in the sense that we have these jumps back and forth in time, sometimes very rapid, and at times a little hard to follow, but you do get used to the fact that even though they're jumping back and forth, they're kind of one character. Vollmann has written these two characters in two different times as one. And I think by doing this, he's trying to express to us as readers that the problems that took place in the 19th century are still with us in the 20th century, just in different ways. He has a quote at the beginning of one of the chapters that talks about population decline caused by syphilis brought by the Europeans into the Arctic, the North American Arctic. And there are other reasons for population decline as well, a lot of which have to do with the Native Americans becoming dependent on Western technology. And as technology grows, their skills grow, but there's also a loss. There's no longer sleds driven by dogs. There are snowmobiles, and the snowmobiles prevent present different problems. If you're off on a snowmobile breaks down, you're stuck. If you're off in a sled, the sled breaks or a dog dies, you've got the other dogs, and you've got some stuff where you can repair your sled, and you're not stuck. You can get back to safety. I don't know, maybe I'm reading a little bit too much in here. But I don't think I am.